Think you know what love looked like in the Middle Ages? Knights in shining armor, fair maidens in towers, and romantic courtship straight out of a fairy tale, right? Well, prepare to have that fantasy completely shattered. Medieval love wasn't the dreamy romance we see in movies. It was a twisted, often horrifying system that would make modern dating apps look like paradise. We're talking about a time when stalking was considered romantic, when marrying a 12-year-old was perfectly normal, and when the church taught that enjoying sex with your own spouse was literally a sin. The medieval approach to love was so disturbing that it makes our worst relationship red flags look like minor inconveniences. You're about to discover how medieval people created a system of romance that was built on ownership, violence, and psychological torture. And you know what? Some of these twisted ideas are still lurking in our modern concept of love. Ready to see how dark medieval romance really got? Let's dive into a world where happily ever after was never actually the goal. 1. The art of suffering. Here's where medieval romance gets really twisted. The nobility literally invented a love philosophy based on never getting what you wanted. Welcome to courtly love, the medieval world's most sophisticated form of emotional self-harm. Picture this scenario that was considered the height of romance. A knight falls madly in love with a married noblewoman, but instead of moving on like a sane person, he dedicates his entire existence to worshiping her from afar. He writes poems about his agony, fights battles in her name, and spends years, sometimes decades, pining for someone he can never have. And here's the kicker. This suffering was the whole point. Medieval troubadours turned unrequited love into an art form. They genuinely believed that true love had to involve pain, rejection, and endless longing. Getting the girl, that was for peasants. Real aristocratic love meant cultivating exquisite emotional torture and calling it noble. The rules were insane. A true lover had to lose sleep, lose appetite, and basically lose his mind over his beloved. If she showed him kindness, he was supposed to become even more tormented. If she ignored him completely, that was proof of her virtue and his devotion. It was like a medieval instruction manual for developing an anxiety disorder. And the women? They were trapped in this system too, expected to remain cold and distant to prove their worth. Showing genuine affection would make them seem cheap or common. So everyone involved was basically required to be miserable to maintain their social status. This wasn't just poetry. It shaped real relationships among the medieval elite. Nobles actually lived this way, turning love into a performance of sophisticated suffering that could last entire lifetimes. 2. Marriage as business transaction. Forget everything you think you know about medieval weddings. They weren't about love, they were about livestock, land, and cold hard cash. Medieval marriage was essentially legalized human trafficking with fancy ceremonies. Here's how it actually worked. Parents would arrange marriages for children as young as 7 years old. Yes, 7. These weren't symbolic betrothals either. They were binding contracts with financial penalties for backing out. A medieval father didn't ask, "Will this person make my daughter happy?" He asked, "How many acres of land comes with this deal?" The dowry system turned women into walking price tags. Families literally negotiated a woman's worth like they were buying a prize horse. "I'll give you 3 cows, 50 acres, and my daughter for your youngest son." The woman had about as much say in the matter as the livestock. Marriage contracts read like business mergers because that's exactly what they were. They specified property transfers, inheritance rights, and what happened if the merchandise, aka the bride, turned out to be defective. If a woman couldn't produce male heirs, her husband could return her to her family like a broken tool. Children were married off to secure military alliances, settle debts, or climb the social ladder. Love was not just irrelevant, it was actually suspicious. If two people genuinely wanted to marry each other, their families worried there might be something wrong with the arrangement. And here's the most disturbing part. Many of these child brides never saw their families again after the wedding day. They were shipped off to strange households, sometimes in foreign countries, to live with people who viewed them as nothing more than expensive breeding stock and political insurance policies. It was human commerce with wedding bells. 3. The church's war on pleasure. The medieval church didn't just frown upon sexual pleasure, it declared total war on it. Their twisted theology turned basic human desire into a demonic conspiracy that would make even the most conservative modern religious leaders blush. Here's what medieval Christians were actually taught. Enjoying sex was a sin, even within marriage, even for the purpose of making babies. The church literally preached that if you felt pleasure during intercourse, you were committing a sin against God. They recommended that married couples approach sex like they were taking medicine, get it over with quickly, and feel appropriately guilty afterward. The church created an entire calendar of when married couples were forbidden from having sex. No sex on Sundays, religious holidays, during Lent, during Advent, during your wife's menstrual period, during pregnancy, while breastfeeding, on Wednesdays, on Fridays, and on Saturdays. Do the math. That left about 40 days per year when sex was technically allowed. But wait, it gets worse. Medieval theologians taught that sexual desire was literally Satan working through your body. They believed that before Adam and Eve's fall, humans reproduced without any physical pleasure or desire, like plants pollinating in the wind. The fact that sex felt good was proof that humanity was corrupted by evil. Women got the worst of it. The church taught that women were inherently more lustful and therefore more dangerous to men's souls. Female sexuality was seen as a trap set by the devil to drag righteous men into damnation. This created a culture where women were simultaneously blamed for men's desires and punished for having their own. Marriage wasn't a celebration of love, it was a damage control system designed to contain the evil of human sexuality within socially acceptable boundaries. The church literally taught that celibacy was morally superior to marriage, and marriage was only barely better than burning in hell for fornication. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval Christianity turned the most basic human drive into psychological warfare against believers' own bodies. 4. Violence as romantic gesture. Medieval men didn't just court women, they conquered them, and society applauded like it was watching the world's most violent reality dating show. What we'd call restraining order material today was considered peak romance in the Middle Ages. Medieval literature is stuffed with tales of knights who literally kidnapped women they fancied, and this was portrayed as romantic adventure rather than a very special episode of Criminal Minds. The medieval logic was bulletproof. If a man wanted a woman badly enough to risk life and limb to snatch her, that proved his love was genuine. Her opinion on the matter, about as relevant as a vegetarian option at a medieval feast. Tournaments weren't sporting events. They were elaborate violence pageants designed to make women swoon. Knights would pummel each other into medieval meatloaf while ladies cheered from the stands like it was The Bachelor meets Gladiator. The bloodier the spectacle, the more romantic it supposedly became. Modern UFC fights look like gentle yoga compared to medieval tournaments where "till death do us part" was more of a scheduling suggestion than a wedding vow. I can barely handle getting a flu shot, but these guys were out here getting concussions for love. Can you imagine Francis Ngannou and 60 pounds of armor on horseback? He'd need a crane just to mount up. The proving your love through violence philosophy extended well beyond tournaments. Men were expected to fight duels, start wars, and commit various acts of brutality to demonstrate romantic devotion. If you weren't willing to commit at least light genocide for your beloved, you obviously weren't serious about their relationship. Here's where it gets truly unhinged. Women were conditioned to find this attractive. Medieval literature constantly pushed the narrative that violent, aggressive, dominant men were premium dating material, while gentle, peaceful guys were portrayed as about as sexually appealing as medieval dental hygiene. The notorious right of the first night, where feudal lords claimed dibs on any newly married woman in their territory, wasn't just a power move. It was packaged as the ultimate romantic test. Would the husband fight to the death to protect his bride's honor? If not, clearly he wasn't husband material. Nothing says happily ever after, like potentially dying on your wedding night. Medieval romance essentially taught that love and violence were synonyms. The more brutally you could dominate others in your beloved's name, the more romantic you were considered. 5. Women as property and prizes. In medieval society, women weren't people, they were collectible items, and the entire romantic system was designed around men competing to own the most valuable specimens. Here's how medieval romance actually worked. Women were literally prizes to be won in competitions. Knights didn't fight for honor or glory. They fought for the right to possess specific women like trophies. Tournaments had human prizes alongside the gold and horses, and women were expected to be grateful for being awarded to the winner like a championship belt. The language tells you everything. Men didn't marry women, they won them, conquered them, or claimed them. Women didn't have relationships, and they were possessed, owned, or held. Medieval love songs sound romantic until you realize they're using the exact same vocabulary as property contracts. Adultery laws reveal the truth about medieval love. If a woman cheated on her husband, it wasn't considered emotional betrayal, it was theft. Another man had stolen the husband's property. The woman herself was treated like a piece of livestock that had wandered into the wrong pasture. The ultimate romantic fantasy for medieval men was capturing a woman from an enemy. This wasn't metaphorical. They literally stole women during raids and wars, then expected these traumatized captives to fall in love with their kidnappers. And medieval literature portrayed this as the most romantic scenario possible. Women had no legal identity separate from their male relatives. A father owned his daughters until he transferred ownership to their husbands. Women couldn't own property, make contracts, or even testify in court without a man's permission. Romance was just the pretty packaging around a system of human ownership. The concept of a woman choosing her own partner was so foreign that medieval people literally couldn't comprehend it. Love was something that happened to women, not something they participated in. They were beautiful objects to be competed for, not human beings with their own desires and agency. Medieval romance wasn't about two people falling in love. It was about men collecting women like rare coins and women learning to be grateful for being collected. 6. Death before dishonor. Medieval people were absolutely obsessed with tragic love stories, and here's the twisted part. They genuinely believed that dying for love was more romantic than actually living happily together. Death wasn't the enemy of medieval romance, it was the ultimate goal. The most celebrated love stories of the Middle Ages all ended in tragedy. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Abelard and Heloise. These weren't cautionary tales about love gone wrong. They were held up as the perfect examples of what true love should look like. The message was clear. If your love story doesn't end in death, destruction, or lifelong suffering, you're not loving hard enough. Medieval nobles actually competed to have the most tragic love story. They'd manufacture dramatic obstacles, create impossible situations, and engineer their own romantic disasters just to prove their love was as intense as the legendary tales. Living happily ever after was for peasants. Aristocratic love required spectacular suffering. The concept of dying of love was taken literally. Medieval people genuinely believed that true lovers could die from heartbreak, and they considered this the most noble way to go. Medical texts from the period describe lovesickness as a real disease that could be fatal. Doctors wrote prescriptions for lovesickness that included everything from bloodletting to exorcism. Suicide for love wasn't just acceptable, it was romantic. Medieval literature is packed with lovers who kill themselves rather than live without their beloved, and these characters are portrayed as heroes, not victims of mental illness. The idea that you might work through relationship problems or find love again was considered shallow and unworthy. The ultimate romantic gesture was mutual destruction. The perfect medieval love story involved two lovers bringing about each other's deaths through their passion. Romeo and Juliet wasn't Shakespeare's original idea. He was just recycling a medieval romantic formula that had been popular for centuries. Medieval people literally believed that love was supposed to destroy you. If you survived your great love affair, you were doing it wrong.